Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Marie-Paul, and thank you, Aisha, for this opportunity. And thanks to Twitter, because that's how I saw this. And so yay for social networks. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I'll kind of introduce myself and what I will be talking about today. So as Lisa said, I currently work at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. This is my first year there as the program coordinator for the World Language Teacher Education Program, which is brand new. It had been gotten rid of. They got rid of it, now they brought it back. And so I finished my doctorate at Texas A&M I defended last May and graduated in August. And so I'm very excited to be here. I was a language teacher for 21 years, French and Spanish. So as I was working on my doctoral research, I really wanted to think about, culture. And we talk about intercultural competence a lot when we talk about languages, but I wanted to focus on that critical aspect of, are we looking at dismantling systems of oppression? Are we looking at dismantling stereotypes? And are we making sure that our students in the classroom are represented in our curriculum and what we do in the classroom? So that really spoke to me as I was doing my research. And so, as Lisa said, that is my research, is exploring this critical intercultural competency in world language. And what does that look like? And the focus is really on teachers in that aspect. So I always like to start presentations with quotes. I think it sets a tone. And I love this quote from Bell Hooks. The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility. And I think that's where this critical intercultural competency comes into play, is that giving these students a space to be their authentic selves. And how do we do that? How do we bring them in and create this community? And so a little bit about me. As I said, I taught in public, private, college, boarding. I've hit everything. And I also have a degree in marketing and French and Spanish. I studied French at NYU Paris for a while, well, 4 summers. And then I identify as a gay cisnormative male, and I'm from West Central Alabama, which is the South. And I'm sure with everything going on in the US, you know about the South. And yes, it's like that. So a very closed off conservative upbringing, which again is one of the reasons why I decided to research this. And then I also am married, and I have a 7, almost 8-year-old that keeps me on my toes. So all of these things kind of combine to give me this passion and this idea for looking at critical intercultural competency. And so in the context of the US, because that's where my research took place, 54% of our students in K-12 schools identify as non-white. So that is in great juxtaposition to the 80% of teachers in public schools who teach languages identify as white. And in private schools, it's 83%. So when I found this data, I realized that there's a really big gap as far as representation goes. So how can we look at this to make sure those students who don't identify as white are accepted and feel welcomed in a language classroom? And in the US, zoning is often done in a way where students go to school with students who look like them, but their teachers do not look like them. And so how do we, again, make sure that those students aren't being left behind and not being seen in what they are doing in the language classroom? So what's the result of this? Is that diverse students continue to feel underrepresented. They continue to be victims of this system of oppression and discrimination, whether it is implicit, explicit, it's a fact. They feel that way. And then white students and teachers, whether we mean to or not, we tend to promulgate these systems of oppression by the way we present culture in our classroom, where we might only focus on a Eurocentric, cultural perspective of the language, instead of looking at all the other countries that speak the language, and all the various cultural aspects that come from those countries. So when I was looking at this, I had 3 research questions. And again, like I said, this really focused on teachers. So how do language teachers describe the influences of the textbooks that they're using when they teach culture? As I'll talk about, it remains a fact that in the US, most language teachers have a textbook, and they're using that textbook as their resource, and sometimes their only resource. And then what factors do teachers report as influencing their cultural lessons, especially interculturality and critical interculturality? And then finally, have they had any training? Pre-service, post-service, novice, veteran, what training have they had to even attempt to do this work? And you'll see there's some interesting information that I found out. So the way I approached this, a theoretical framework was critical consciousness, which is Freire. And I kind of bookend that with 3 conceptual frameworks.
Oh, Jason? Is he frozen on everybody's screen?
Yes, it is for me.
Oh,
Okay, you are back. Good.
okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Okay. And as I get the thing, your internet connection is unstable. So I'm not sure where I cut off, but my theoretical framework was looking at this critical consciousness, thinking about what are we teaching? How does society influence what we're doing in the classroom? How does that affect our own prejudices and biases? And then I kind of supported that with these conceptual frameworks from Latson, Billings, Gay, and Paris and Alim, because I feel like they really support this theoretical framework and really allow for space for teachers to dig into where they come from. What influences does their life have on them, where they're from? I'm from the South, so I have very different influences than someone from, California or Washington State or something like that. Ooh, there we go. So what I did is this case study, and I looked at culture as a symbol, and I decided to go with symbolic interactionism because it really is how do teachers interact with the culture? I've worked with teachers where it's very, like I said, Eurocentric, and they only focus on France or Spain, and if they talk about something else, it's just, oh, in this country, this is the capital, and these are the things that they do, but it's not a deep dive. It's very superficial. And so I wanted to know what teachers thought about culture. Is it important? Do they even consider it important? Or are they more grammar vocab focused? And then I also wanted to know, from their experiences, how does that influence what they're doing in their classrooms? Because we all come in with experiences and we tend to mimic what we saw as students. I designed a qualitative study because I wanted to understand the influences of, teachers and their experience with critical interculturality. I used an anonymous survey for public and private school teachers. And I also did a textual analysis, as we'll talk about. I looked at 6 different textbooks from 3 different publishers. So from each publisher, I looked at a French and a Spanish textbook to try to see where is culture in the textbook? What does it look like? How far does it go? So that's kind of how I set that up. There we go. So an online anonymous 20-question survey. I had 18 participants that completed the survey. I only focused on high school modern language teachers. I did not look at Latin, and I did not look at anybody below the high school level. I used social media, just like I found the CERLL. I put it out on social media, just, to try and stimulate some participation. I use snowball and purposeful sampling. Like I said, picked teachers and then said, here, feel free to share this with your other high school teachers, making it snowball. And for the textual analysis, I looked at various textbooks and kind of came up with certain aspects I was looking for: essential questions, can-do statements, embedded culture, cultural lessons, and are there student and teacher notes that are focused on culture? So those are the things that I looked for all the textbooks that I looked at. And as you'll see, it's some interesting findings, or at least I think they're very interesting findings. So for the teacher survey, the whole goal really was to, what are the themes and what are the patterns that come out of what the teachers say? Because I had a combination of opening questions, Likert scale questions, and then multiple choice questions. And to really find out, where does culture play a role? And beyond that, what do teachers think about the importance of having a relationship with their students, like getting to know their students? Do they find that important as a language teacher to teach culture in the classroom? And then again, for the textual analysis, I looked at 6 total textbooks from 3 major publishers. And I really wanted to look at, taking a step back, what is the hierarchy that we see between grammar and vocab, and where does that line up with culture? Also, with the proficiency-based movement, intercultural competence is very important and is on par with every other, speaking, listening. So where does that play? Are they really using the culture, or is it really a focus on other aspects of the language? So this is kind of how I did my analysis. I got the survey results, I put them in Google Sheets, and then coded them using in vivo values and descriptive coding. And then that kind of helped me extrapolate those themes and those patterns. For the textual analysis, I went through lessons and chapters and then organized the information around the essential questions, can-do statements, embedded culture, culture lessons, and student and teacher notes, and kind of to get an overview of what was presented in those textbooks. And also interesting, if this, because I picked 3 different textbook companies, was one book more culturally engaging than another, book from the same publisher. And I did see that, which was also interesting. So here's what I found. So for my participants, it spoke to the data that I had from the national statistics. So 11 of the 18 identified as white, which goes with what, was said, 80 to 83% of teachers are white. I was surprised to find, honestly, that 11, so the vast majority of them had been teaching for 20 plus years, because the lifespan of a teacher right now in the United States is between 3 and 5 years, and then they leave the profession. So I was happy to see that, but it was also interesting to find that there were teachers, the majority had been there for 20 plus years. 9 were private, 9 were public, which was nice. It was kind of an even split. I had 1 was other. It was an international school that was based in the States. I also found that the majority of teachers that I surveyed had master's degrees. Only 1 had a bachelor's, and then 5 had doctorates. 12 of them were female and 6 were male. And that, again, echoes the national data, is that majority of language teachers in the US are female. And then I was interested to find that 5 Spanish wasn't that surprising. I had 3 French and 1 Mandarin, but the 6 of the people that responded taught multiple languages, which was interesting because when I started teaching, I was the only person in the first 2 schools where I taught that spoke multiple languages. So it was really interesting to find that 6 of the people spoke multiple languages, and some of them, 1 was Spanish and Chinese, Mandarin, Some were French and German. So it was an interesting combination. It wasn't consistent necessarily across, like, oh, everybody was French and Spanish. So it was really interesting. And I would love to, as I continue my research, to find out more about that, to kind of engage in that. So how do language teachers say that, describe their influence, the influences of textbooks? So what I found is, 7 of the 18 said that they use textbooks. And I will say I expected it to be a higher number, but again, maybe they're seeing textbooks. There's also online textbooks, and I don't know if they're considering those as a textbook. So again, being the researcher, I could go back and tweak my questions in the future. And so, essential questions, these are the things that I was looking for in those textbooks to see if they used those or if they provided information for teachers as they were planning their cultural lessons. So what I found, I'll put all these up, is that publisher A, I kept all the books and the publisher anonymous. So French had their French textbook for publisher A had 1 essential question and 2 follow-up questions. Their Spanish version had 3 essential questions, but none of these questions focused on critical intercultural competency and really didn't really focus on intercultural competency. It was, again, more of this high-level cultural perspective where students are not asked to deep dive or to really make conscious, consistent cultural comparisons between, this is my cultural experience. What is a cultural experience look like from somebody from Senegal or somebody from Argentina? It never really asked them to do that. It was more stereotypical, verged on stereotypical. For publisher B, there was no essential question. They had something called a question centrale, and which more or less is kind of a essential question, but again, that neither of these textbooks focused on culture. It really was more of a standard, what do people wear here? Or what do they eat for lunch? It never asked them to really dig into, well, why do they wear that? Why is this one of their, foods that they eat? Why do they speak French? If they're in West Africa, why do they speak French? It never really asked those deep questions. And then publisher 3 was the only one of the companies that moved toward a focus on intercultural competency and even the critical aspect. So their French edition that I looked at had 3 essential questions, and 1 was specifically intercultural, and that was the same with their Spanish text. And what was nice to see in publisher C is it was aligned. Their French text and their Spanish text, they were aligned. And that I didn't see that in publisher A and B, which then goes into the realm of, are they placing one language above another? And what it looks like is that the Spanish textbooks were updated more often than the French textbooks. And which is unfortunate, but that's, from what I saw in my research, that's what I saw with that. For the can-do statements, so these are examples of the can-do statements, and you can look, I mean, I know it's very tiny, but what you will see if you looked at them, none of them delve into cultural comparisons, disentangling cultural information. It really was, describe my daily routine, write an ad for a product or a store. And those are noble can-do statements, but if you're writing an ad, as we all know, if anybody who's done language, writing an ad in a different language can change or be very different from city to city and definitely from country to country. And it did not even get into that. Publisher B, again, really didn't have anything that was cultural. A lot of it was very grammar focused and a lot of it was very vocab focused. And it did not again, ask the students to deep dive or even set up the students to really think more critically about culture as they're studying the language. Publisher C did have more of a cultural component. So on the left is the French, on the right is the Spanish, and for publisher, I can identify some familiar products, landmarks, and monuments and what they represent to the Francophone people. So it was good to see that. I mean, it's starting that process, that's starting that journey into breaking down and disentangling culture from history sometimes. And then for the Spanish one, I can recognize greeting and leave-taking norms in different Spanish-speaking countries. Again, it's a toe in the water, so to speak, for cultural, intercultural competency. But again, it's not looking at deeper cultural connections between the students and what they're learning in the language classroom. And, the reason being is that students want to see themselves in the curriculum. They want to see themselves in what they're doing. And from what I have found so far, as you can see, that's not happening. It's really not bringing in the students' perspectives or voices into the classroom. Embedded culture, again, was very much of the same. Basic comprehension, nothing that was really intercultural. It was more, they would have characters that had cultural names, which again verges on stereotypes. Why not invest more into deep diving into the culture? Publisher B had very few observations of additional cultural information. It was all housed in the cultural, I say the quote unquote, cultural lesson. And that's where you only really found the only cultural information. It really wasn't sprinkled throughout the chapter at all. Publisher C, culture, it was throughout the whole chapter. It was sprinkled in here and there. There was different types of visuals to represent the culture. They had media. It was evident that it was more, they were more conscientious about putting in culture throughout the text and not just in the, this is a cultural lesson for chapter 1. It was a key component, unlike publishers A and B. Cultural lessons, again, it's kind of the same. Some of the, for publisher A, were intercultural, not many of them. It was, again, very surface level, and the culture that dipped below that surface level was really at the very end of the chapter, which, as anybody who's ever taught, stuff that's usually at the end of the chapter, it's the stuff that's going to inevitably get left off because we feel like we run out of time. Publisher B, culture, again, was completely separate. It did not integrate it into the text itself. So, for a student coming in, it's like, oh, here's the language, and then the culture is a separate thing. And that's not, culture and language are interconnected. They are, they feed off of one another. They evolve together. It didn't do that. And only one of the 6 final activities had anything to do with interculturality. And again, it wasn't very profound. It was more of a, as much a beginner level into interculturality as you could get, I would say. Publisher C, there was no traditional cultural lessons because cultural lessons were embedded throughout the entire chapter. It was the beginning, and it played through the whole chapter to the end. And one thing that they did is they had actual teenagers from the different countries that they were focusing on that had videos and letters and those types of things. So the students really became part, excuse me, of the lesson. And so it had a lot of information in there. The only thing I would say, it might have been oversaturation. There might have been too much information for students to synthesize. And I say this in that when you have even a veteran teacher, but definitely a novice teacher goes in and they're presented with a textbook that has amazing components to it. If there are too many, that could be very daunting for the teacher, and they might start to let things drop to the side, especially things they don't feel comfortable discussing, whether it be socially or because they didn't learn how to teach that, whatever it may be. That was my only kind of question about Publisher C, is that was there too much information, and could it be synthesized down a bit? So teacher and student notes. So kind of, as I was talking before, a lot of times teachers don't have, as language teachers, we're supposed to be grammarians, historians, artists, architects, archaeologists. We have so many hats that we're wearing. It's important to have these teacher and student notes to help us, either tell us where we can go and learn some more information, or give me some information in the text. So I really wanted to look at what do these look like? Are they cultural, or are they grammar vocab based or focused? And for the most part, they were mostly vocab grammar. There were some cultural questions that were proposed. I think it, again, could go, there's no perfect anything, but I think it could go a little bit deeper. So as you can see in Publisher A, they talk about this lake in Senegal, and they ask, why is it pink? Which is important. I mean, you can tie that into ecology, conservation, but it just kind of stops at a certain point and you don't go any further. So in a lot of these texts, culture came across almost as a checklist item, and where it shouldn't be, because that's such a key component of learning a language. In Publisher B, it was, in the French text, it was more grammar. And again, this is where the Spanish texts tended to go further, and I don't know why that hierarchy existed within these companies. I can assume that it's because more people speak Spanish in the United States, but I really don't know. But they had a really good question, I think. What are the most popular social media platforms among your friends? I think that's a great door opening into, let's talk about deep dive. Let's talk about critical intercultural competency, but it stopped. There were no other notes for the students, and there were no other notes for the teachers of how they might do that. And I think sometimes, when we talk about technology, we just assume that people know how to really talk about it and engage in it, but that's not the case, especially if we're talking about a teacher who has been teaching for a really long time, and technology is not something they use very often, or they don't feel comfortable doing. The textbook really does become a place of a real resource where they need, that guidance. Publisher C had more. I mean, again, they were the one out of all of them that added a little extra to really get us towards that CIC, that critical intercultural competency. How are schools in the Francophone world similar to or different from your school? I think it's important to ask the why. And I think that's where it's left off so often, is the why. Well, why is it that way? Because that is critical intercultural competency. Why is this the way it is there? Because maybe that's similar to things here in the United States. History, the way society has evolved, social change, social norms, those things are important. And for the student notes, and it was different ways to say things, which again is important. Again, I think you can go further than that, but everything is a work in progress. So those are what I found as far as teacher and student notes. So when I look back at all of my data from the textbooks after looking at them, these are some things that kind of jumped out to me, is that it still remains grammar and vocab focused. Those are the stars of the textbooks. It is the vocab and the grammar. Culture, if and when it's presented, is very disconnected. It's not presented in a way where students would look at culture and think, this is part of language learning. It wasn't presented that way at all. It was just in and of itself, physically doing that kind of presents culture in a way of, it's not that important. We put it at the end because if we get to it, we can get to it. If not, it's no problem. You can conjugate in the, the imparfait and the passé composé and you're great, which is important. I do realize that, but there's so much more to French language and Francophone language and cultures than that. And only one publisher included cultural components and instructions outside of and that was publisher C. They were the only ones that had culture sprinkled throughout so that you were constantly reminded of the cultural component. It was the only one that I found that did that. So when I asked teachers in the survey, what influences your cultural lessons? Like, well, where do you get your information from? And what I found is that I wanted to know, what do you think CIC is? Well, what is CIC in your opinion? Like when you see those three words, what comes to mind? And what I found is that multiple teachers said that when you engage in CIC, the whole point is acknowledging your students and their cultural backgrounds, which is so true. It's 100% true. That differences are not indicators of what's good and what's bad. Making cultural comparisons is important to respectfully navigating other cultures. That culture is complex and contextual. They talked about pre-existing societal structures, whether that's a system of oppression or the way society is organized so that certain people have privileges over others. Accepting things that are different, and this moment of self-reflection, an ability to see, culture from different perspectives. So the teachers really, for the most part, understand the tenets of what CIC is. They do get that. What I found was they don't do it. So they realize that it's important. The majority, again, of the teachers that I surveyed, they do understand that it's important, but they don't get to it or they don't engage in it. And so I asked them why. And as you can see, the number one reason, so half of the participants marked lack of appropriate professional development, is because they don't know how. They've never been taught, either never been taught at all how to teach culture, or definitely not been taught or had the possibility of learning how to really deep dive into critical intercultural competency. So they realize, the majority realize it's important, but they don't know how to do it. They've not been offered or given the opportunity to learn how to do it. And so I asked them on a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think that critical intercultural competency is? And as you can see, again, majority said, yes, it's very important. But again, it falls back to, I can know that, eating healthy is very important, but I might not know how to do that. And so I feel like that's kind of where these teachers are, is like, yes, I know it's important and I want to do it. I don't know how to do it. And I went further and asked them, well, how often do you go beyond your standard cultural lessons? Like do you talk about discrimination? Do you talk about, for example, La Négritude, the movement in France, where these Black authors just, this explosion of literature kind of coincided with the Harlem Renaissance. Do you go beyond that? And I had more than 3, or I'm sorry. So 9 said that 3 times a unit, more than 3 times a unit or chapter. In retrospect, I wish I would have asked for explanations of how you do that, because even though they said they did deep dives, again, if teachers don't necessarily understand how to teach it, they might be thinking they're engaging in it and they're not. So again, as we do research, we learn how to tweak things for the next round. So that's something I would definitely clarify and really try to get at the heart of if I were to do a study again or to expand on this study. And then I wanted to know, what do you avoid? And it's probably not surprising, but at the same time, those are the things that don't need to be avoided because those are the things that are happening in students' lives every single day. And again, I understand why they might avoid them, but there are ways to talk about politics, gender, sex, and religion in constructive and informative ways. But again, teachers haven't learned how to do that. They've not had that development, professional development, or schooling in their university program. It was nice to see that 7 people put none, that they talk about anything and everything, which was great. Because it was anonymous, I don't know who these were, but it would be interesting in the future to interview those teachers to talk about how do you navigate those, to talk about anything. And I know we're getting close to time, so I'm going to go through here. So I wanted to find out kind of how do they validate their students in classrooms and get to know them. And so some of the things they said in general were student interaction, getting students to really participate in class, find out about their cultural identifiers, teachers talking about their personal experiences with culture, and then creating an environment that was, building that respectful relationship with your students to have the space where students can speak their truth, have a voice, were some of the things that they identified that they try to do. And then for some other things, they talked about, when we learn about other people, we start to, understand ourselves better. It teaches compassion and understanding. The more students understand themselves, the more they understand others. They're more receptive to learning about culture when you create this space. And that's so true. But again, understanding and the desire to talk about CIC and the noble reasons why to do so is not what I found in the reality. As you saw, 9 people talked about they had no idea how to do it. And that's over half of the people who participated. So there is that desire, but the reality of how to put it into practice, they don't have. It hasn't been, they don't have it. It's not been provided to them. And so what training do teachers have? I was really interested to find out about this. What training did they ever have to talk about CIC? And of 18 people, 1 teacher had a course. And it wasn't even a course that really had a deep dive into it, but at least had some aspects of CIC. And what I got from my research is that teachers enter the classroom and they like to say, this is a neutral classroom. There's neutrality here. The problem is that that's a falsehood. There's no classroom in the world that's neutral, because a teacher, whether they realize it or not, is going to exude their beliefs and their biases, even if they don't realize they're doing it. They are doing it. So there is no neutral classroom. And I think that's hard for some teachers. They don't realize that. They're like, but everything is welcome in my classroom. Well, that's great. But the way you present stuff, what you do talk about and don't talk about, it's not neutral. And then silence. Silence is being in that silence and lean into the silence, because silence can be very powerful and give students moments to think about stuff, and giving them the moment to process cultural information and not expect them, okay, tell me in 2 minutes what's going on. Adults can't function like that, and certainly high schoolers cannot function that quickly. Their brains don't work that way. So we have to remember that and to lean into the silence and not just get, oh, there's been 30 seconds of silence, we got to move on. We can't do that, because it shuts students down and it sets a precedent of, this is how I'm doing my class. So I did see that teachers want to value others. They want to talk about the commonalities, that humanity is, we're more common than we are different. We need to be open-minded and respectful, but also teachers need to do that. So that's the whole neutrality and the silence thing. Are teachers showing that to their students? We need to have students learn about their own biases. And so that's either working together or deep diving into the culture. And I think something so important is, connecting with outside stakeholders. They need to connect with people outside of the classroom. A lot of times with people that reflect their identities, their intersectionalities, and then also people who don't. Because I think that's an important point. We don't want to just find the people who look like us, but that is, again, very important for me to see that as a student. But it's also important for me to have experience with people who don't think like I do, or don't believe in the same things as I do, because that's part of language learning. That's part of the human experience. Self-awareness, again, that goes into that. I need to be self-aware of what I'm doing, what I'm saying, my body language even. And then teacher engagement is, teachers set the tone. They are considered the nexus of power and the nexus of knowledge in a classroom. And they need to be able, and empowered teachers need to say, I don't know. I don't know about that. I will get back to you. Because again, as language professionals, we're expected to know so many things. Unlike any other content area, we're expected to know everything about everything in a language and a culture. And that's just not possible. And so I think teachers need to give themselves some grace to say, I don't know. And then hopefully there will be professional development for teachers to learn how to do these things. And what happens is when, teachers don't feel comfortable or confident in teaching that cultural context or intercultural competency, it's teacher-centered. So everything falls on the teacher. It's really it's not, the students don't really engage in it. They don't struggle with it, get uncomfortable, which is when they really learn. It becomes very teacher-centered instruction. So some lessons that I learned from this is that not one teacher talked about culturally relevant pedagogies, sustaining pedagogies, or relevant teaching, not one. There were few pedagogical approaches to create some kind of dialogue. So like translanguaging and third space, I mean, very few people engaged in that in their classrooms. It's probably because they don't know what those are. But both can be very powerful in the classroom. Time, they don't have time, or they don't feel like they have time. There's no training or PD. So 13 out of 18 stated that. Then, surprisingly, two participants told flat out in their responses when I asked, do you think it's important to understand a student's experiences, identities, and cultural background in order to be an effective teacher? And they flat out said, no, that's not my job. Which was shocking and sad, because I feel like as educators and especially language teachers, that should be part of our job. So we should want to know who our students are and engage with them. And I think that's the entryway into critical intercultural competency. And then again, this lack of, they don't know what CIC is. And again, it's not teachers' fault. It's just the way they've been taught and the way that their professional development is structured for them. And again, I think the most important thing is that they do want to know, but it's like, where do they go for it? And so if this continues, we have this continued alienation and dismissal of non-white students. We have this, well, I know what I know, and I'm just going to stick with that. I'm not going to stretch myself to really get outside of that because I'm in my comfort zone. It just continues again to reinforce these systems of oppression. I don't know about in Canada, but the number of students taking language in the US continues to drop. And I really would love to do more research because I think this is one of the reasons, is because this is not being done. And just this reinforcement of stereotypes, and which is exactly what we don't want to do in the language classroom. And again, we teach for students. And even if they can speak, I heard this today, actually. Had lunch with my doctoral chair. She has a new student who is going to be researching a similar thing that I am, and she called them fluent fools. So you can speak the language beautifully, but you are culturally not proficient. And that's a problem. So just because you can speak a language doesn't mean that you are culturally fluent in that language, which is so important. And like I say here, it could create very tense or traumatic experiences if a student it goes abroad because they haven't been taught this. So I came up with an idea, a proposed intervention, and it was a professional development. And so it was a 5-session professional development where we looked at clarifying discussions, talking about what is the dangers of neutrality, and then sharing out. And notice that this was not, we're not really jumping into how do you teach culturally critical intercultural competency. That's not where we're starting. We're kind of starting from this very base level. Then it moves up to looking at research, pair and share, and really teachers working together. Not this, I'm going to teach and lecture to you and tell you how to do this. Teachers need to work together, especially doing this as a department. I envisioned it as a language department at a certain institution, and having them go through this. And as I was looking at this, I developed a model to kind of look at where teachers are at, and I called it the critical intercultural competency self-reflection model. And so a lot of teachers live here, and I called it yum, yay, and yippee. So it's like, oh, they eat this here and they celebrate this way. And they're living in this, I don't know. So I'm fine. I don't know. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. But that's not good for the students. So they move through this exposure and discovery, which is passive engagement, where I know I don't know. So there are things I don't know, and now I realize that. There's going to be some resistance here because they're going to be like, I don't want to change. I'm comfortable with what I'm doing. I don't want you to make me feel uncomfortable. That's the learning and struggling and realizing I know what I know. Now let me get actively engaged and let me change that. Let me learn, not from my mistakes, but learn from where my gaps in knowledge and experience are, which I termed as self-reflection, which then moves into the self-realization of, now that I know this, these are my guiding principles, and this is going to directly impact me teaching critical intercultural competency, because now I've had the practice and the collaboration, and I can't sit there and say, I don't know, because I've learned that. And that is really a lot of deep reflection on teachers and their experiences and their own biases and prejudices to help them move from this false bliss down here to where they really do understand and are making a concerted effort. And this model was based off of William Taylor's model. And I tweaked it and reformulated it for this purpose. And that was my research. And thank you so much for everybody being here. I appreciate it. And yeah.
Thank you, Jason. I'm gonna try out my reaction buttons right here and invite the rest of you to do so too. I'm also gonna stop recording so that we have some time for questions and answers and that we might feel more comfortable that way.